Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. I'm Catherine Marshall. I'm based at Georgetown University. I'm the vice president of the G20 Interfaith Forum, but I'm currently speaking to you from Rabat, Morocco. We have a remarkably diverse set of people speaking today from many different continents. I haven't even counted them. But you have a very international group. This is the fourth of 5 webinars that the Berkley Center at Georgetown University and the G20 Interfaith Forum are organizing to focus on priority issues and priority recommendations to the G20, which will meet in its summit in Rio de Janeiro in the end of November. This webinar is focused on a particularly painful topic, which is human trafficking. And it is one where a wide range of different religious communities have been very directly involved in working to bring this scourge to an end. So today we're going to focus, first of all, on what is the problem, telling us about why trafficking is such an issue, why it's been so difficult to address in so many parts of the world. We're also going to focus on what religious communities, religious ideas have to do with this problem and how we see them unfolding in the future. David Saperstein, who's worked with a number of different organizations, including with the US government on trafficking issues, will help to set this in a broader context. And finally, Kevin Hyland, who is leading work on the trafficking issues within the G20 Interfaith Forum, will give us a sense of what he sees happening next and his priorities. You are welcome to pose questions in the Q&A. We will be unlikely to address the questions here, but we'll do so afterwards. And this webinar is being recorded, and we will be posting the recording both on the Berkley Center and on the G20 Interfaith Forum sites. So with that, I'm going to turn first to Tatiana, who is in Zurich, you said, and who's worked for many years on this issue and who will very succinctly give us an idea of what the problem is and what needs to be done about it. Tatiana, over to you.
Thank you so much. And part of the solution, I think, is already happening with the fact that the G20 Interfaith Forum has put this issue as a priority on its agenda, because that's one way to begin to create a real political commitment and a response to the issue. So very quickly, I'll provide you with an overview of what human trafficking is, because it's not what we have been all taught to believe, Eastern European women chained to radiators in different parts of the world, etc. Human trafficking has evolved. It is something that is an international crime, a local crime. It is something that affects households, communities, countries, and the globe overall. It is interlinked with issues such as climate change, as well as conflict-related sexual violence. It is an issue that affects every single one of us, and it's no longer an issue that affects just the global South, with the global North as receiving countries, because the financial flows and issues related to human trafficking are happening in pretty much every country around the globe. No country is immune. Human trafficking funds criminal networks. It funds terrorist activities. So the terrorist acts that we see happening in different parts of the world are also interrelated with human trafficking. It undermines democratic values. and human dignity. And I think this is where also faith-based organizations really play a role, because they've been from the beginning at the forefront of response to human trafficking. I work quite a bit in West Africa, and they were the response to human trafficking in terms of both identification and provision of services. And the other thing that actually needs to be made really, really clear here is that human trafficking is not a social issue. It's not the same thing as homelessness or drug use. It is a crime, and it needs a real response that is coordinated between governments, criminal justice players, and not just civil society, even though civil society plays an important or critical role in the response as well. To put this into perspective, less than 1% of all victims of human trafficking are currently being identified, which is a huge issue. And this is a crime with almost complete impunity, with less than 1% of cases ever being prosecuted, and then even more repealed, or even more actually go to appeal. And the traffickers and those that are participating in all of this have zero punishment or zero consequences for doing so. It is also a crime that generates a massive amount of money annually, so different estimates, but 99 billion a year, US dollars, 2/3 of which is for trafficking for sexual exploitation. Human trafficking has very strong gender components, although human trafficking, as we think, does not only impact women and girls, it also impacts men and boys, both for trafficking for labor exploitation, sexual exploitation, and such. And the other thing to really strongly another thing to really reflect on is the fact that a lot of trafficking now, or components of human trafficking, are happening in cyberspace. So I am sure the rest of, and I've kept it short as promised, and I'm sure the rest of the speakers today will be able to really focus on different components of this and how to really resolve it. But once again, it cannot be resolved without a real political commitment, but also social commitment from political leaders, as well as various faith leaders on resolving this, because otherwise it's just putting a band-aid on the problem. We have had the Palermo Protocol now for almost 25 years. So the international law is there, but the real commitment has not been there. And this is where the gaps are in place that have created this incredible situation. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Tatiana. I think you've given us a very clear idea of the scale of the problem.
Thank you to the Berkley Centre for Religion for this invitation to participate in this esteemed panel for the G20 Interfaith Seminar. I'm very grateful to be here, and it's fantastic to be with such experts. My name is Yasmin Walji. I'm a partner at law firm Hogan Lovells. It's one of the largest commercial law firms operating at the intersection of government, business, and the law. I've had the privilege of shaping the firm's pro bono practice for some 27 years, and this is a cross-office collaboration with a commitment which includes our anti-human trafficking practice. As a firm, we've continually advocated and worked to combat human trafficking in its many forms. As time is short, I wanted to focus these remarks on lessons that we have learned over the 15 years of our experience in this field. And I wanted to end with some recommendations that I feel could be advanced at the G20. Imagine you're a parent and you receive the following text message from your beautiful 26-year-old daughter. Not knowing where she is, but knowing she was supposed to be on her way to work from Vietnam to the UK following an offer of employment. I'm sorry, Mother. My journey has failed. I am dying. I can't breathe. Fan Mai, the young woman who sent these words, was just one of the 39 victims of the Essex 39 lorry case. This was a group who sadly passed away in a truck and a container in Essex and the UK. 1 child, 8 women, 31 men, aged between 15 and 44. I'd ask you to consider for a moment what these last moments of the 39 must have been like. Almost certainly there would have been prayers to relieve them of the misery of this situation, and prayers to take care of their families, knowing that they were close to passing. As advocates for justice, I would suggest that we all have a duty to bear this in mind as we go about our work. This was a case we took on alongside a remarkable NGO, the Vietnamese US NGO Pacific Links Foundation, and we knew it would be challenging. Most of the victims of transnational trafficking, as we've heard, from the global south to the industrialized nations, are often anonymous. They are just numbers reported in the media. And sometimes priority is given to securing a conviction of these perpetrators, but without much regard to identifying and supporting the survivors or the bereaved. We decided at the outset with this case to give an identity to the bereaved and to give them a name and a voice in the criminal justice proceedings. More than that, we wanted to ensure that law enforcement were not just satisfied with a conviction, but were also prepared to undertake financial investigations to disrupt what is a very lucrative trade in human beings, and importantly, to provide reparations for the families. So we represented some of the families of the Essex 39, ensuring that we took statements from the families and introduced these into the criminal justice process in the UK, Belgium, and France, which were countries through which they were trafficked. And in 2022, we successfully secured a significant award for damages from the Brussels, Parisian, and London courts. Our guidance to Pacific Links paved the way for justice for the families of the victims. Indeed, Pacific Links insisted that we undertook asset confiscation, and reparations were at the heart of the criminal justice process. So we argued that reparations should be paid from the assets of the traffickers. Incidentally, as we've heard, it is a very lucrative business. We were informed anecdotally that the sale of the contents, the human beings from that one truck, would have generated $500,000. The courts all recognise that the victims of human trafficking should have access to an effective remedy, which is part of international law. So what did we learn from this case? Well, firstly, it was possible to secure compensation orders from courts against the assets of the offenders, though it requires persistent persuasion because there is real resistance from law enforcement to hearing from victims and their families. Secondly, there needs to be greater collaboration between law enforcement across nations and within nations. Too often, as in this case, we found the law enforcement was unable to communicate with each other or viewed it as a waste of time to even try. And thirdly, there really needs an ability of the victims and survivors to be recognised as part of the criminal justice process, possibly through private representation such as we have done and a collaboration with the public sector partnership of law enforcement. We insisted on this last point, but we are just one firm who were fortunate to have the resources to work globally using the reach of this firm's offices from Vietnam to London with the remarkable Pacific Links Foundation. In order to genuinely make a difference to disrupt this trade in human beings, we need investment by governments to do these financial investigations on a systematic basis and provide reparations to survivors. We all now recognise this is a global international trade in human beings, and sadly it is financing and facilitating continued growth of organised crime. The repercussions for the victims are sustained and long-term, and we need to remember they in turn turn to their faith in a desperate plea to be released from the circumstances. So the recommendations are, just briefly, disruption. We need to ensure that there is a pursuit of criminal convictions, but that's not an end in itself. Justice for the survivors requires reparations to disrupt the trafficking business. Reparations or compensation is absolutely necessary for survivors to regain their sense of dignity, to avoid being re-trafficked, And that matters, otherwise we are further permitting organised crime. And the perpetrators must be held to account through the confiscation of the proceeds of crime. Inevitably, that means there needs to be better cross-border collaboration and investment in law enforcement and financial investigations, and that is a matter for governments. This work is really important to us, and if we're to genuinely make a stop to this awful trade, it is imperative there is investment in law enforcement, not-for-profits, and the church communities that support the survivors of this work. Thank you very much, and I'm happy to invite questions or comments.
Thank you so much for that very moving and very specific description. I think it adds to our sense of the enormity of the challenge and the problem, but also some of the very specific steps that are in front of us that need to be done, and those that involve faith communities, which takes us to Marcio, who has both a direct story of the work that his organization does in this area, and I think also will give us a better sense of why we see the religious communities of the world as so centrally involved in moving this issue forward. So over to you, Marcio.
Thank you. On behalf of the Scalabrini International Migration Network, SIM, I would like to extend our deep gratitude for being invited to take part in this significant and timely discussion. As a faith-based organization inspired by the life and mission of St. John Baptist Scalabrini, we have dedicated ourselves for the past 137 years to the protection, promotion, integration, and advocacy programs for migrants, refugees, seafarers, and fishers. Our firm commitment to addressing the challenges of human trafficking and forced labor is at the core of our mission. As we continue to provide care and protection to vulnerable communities and populations across our more than 60 houses and centers worldwide, in accordance with the United Nations protocols. Religious organizations like SIM have been at the forefront of the fight against human trafficking and modern slavery for decades. This exemplary and quiet work of a multitude of people driven by faith is not sufficiently covered by the media and recognized by governments. Faith-based organizations and partners often work in challenging and dangerous environments to provide shelter, care, and protection to those most at risk of exploitation. This frontline experience gives us unique insights into the scale and impact of human trafficking on these vulnerable communities, including prevention programs and activities. Pope Francis indeed describes human trafficking as a global scourge and has consistently advocated to its eradication. 4 key areas often emerge as crucial for joint commitment and actionable efforts between faith-based organizations and the G20. First, prevention. Providing logistical and financial support to religious communities that promote local social and economic development, as well as public education in regions where state presence is limited, can help reduce vulnerabilities. When education and dignified work are lacking, efforts to combat trafficking are almost futile. Numerous religious organizations operate educational centers in abandoned and impoverished communities, as well as vocational training centers to help integrate individuals into the workforce. These initiatives prevent potential victims from falling into the hands of traffickers. With education and dignified employment, parents will not feel compelled to sell or send their children with strangers to cross borders out of sheer desperation. This despair arises from the lack of opportunities in their communities of origin, which is why Pope Francis emphasizes the right not to emigrate. But until that becomes a reality, it is necessary to expand safe pathways for migrants and asylum seekers, or the fight against these grave wounds of humanity will remain ineffective because it will continue to fester. Second, protection. Ensuring the safety and security of shelters that provide direct support to migrants and refugees is essential to decreasing their exposure to trafficking networks. Religious organizations already operate in many of these safe spaces, but greater collaboration with international actors could enhance their effectiveness. The corruption of money and power is an aggravating factor, causing people who should be protecting the vulnerable to fail in their duties. Victims place greater trust in religious organizations to ask for help or to share their experiences. Catholic Church, for example, maintains a global network dedicated to the care and rehabilitation for rescued individuals. Third, prosecution. Governments must commit to enforcing laws that punish traffickers and eradicate forced labor. By strengthening legal frameworks and ensuring accountability, we can send a clear message that such crimes will not go unpunished. However, this requires genuine and effective political will. Fourth, partnership. Establishing working groups and action plans between religious organizations and international bodies like the G20 will allow us to monitor and respond to changes in trafficking routes and strategies. It is worth noting the low operational cost of religious organizations. Many workers serve for modest salaries or, in some cases, voluntarily, driven by their vocation. They dedicate their lives to promoting human dignity. If these organizations had access to the resources provided by wealthy and generous nations for development financing, such partnerships could significantly amplify the results. In conclusion, on behalf of SIM, I reiterate our profound gratitude for inviting us to participate in this discussion. We are committed to work alongside the G20 and all stakeholders to prevent human trafficking, protect victims, and promote a future of justice, dignity, and hope for all. Together, we can build a world where every person is free because every person is a child of God. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Marcio. I think that you have laid out in a very moving fashion the arguments as to why the religious dimensions of this issue are, first of all, so often invisible, but also so important. The idea of the desperation of people who sell their children, the need for protection of the many millions of people who are involved, the tragedy which Tatiana also highlighted, and Yasmin, of the failures of political will needed to prosecute, and finally the enormous potential but also the gaps at present that exist in partnership. And with that, I will turn to Rabbi David Saperstein, who, as I said earlier, has approached this issue from so many different dimensions, to give us his sense of where this issue sits as the G20 prepares to convene, but as other global bodies seem to repeatedly return to this issue without the kinds of results that we're hoping for. David.
Well, it's always an honor and a pleasure to be part of these Berkley Center webinars and to be with you, Catherine. You're such an important leader in the interfaith global community's engagement with so many of these economic issues. And it should be self-evident by this point why the G20 is such an important player potentially in terms of addressing the crisis that has been described so powerfully. Almost every aspect of his agenda is going to interact with trafficking, economic policy, employment policy, migration, here drug use and drug trafficking, supply chains. I mean, you go down the list how you would deal with natural disasters and the disruption of populations. There is so much that they have to, that the G20 deals with, that addresses things that impact directly on this. And that includes, as was alluded to in the very beginning here, the question of social media and what kind of regulations is going to be on social media. So it is quite clear, and I urge people to read the wonderful backgrounder that the IF20 prepared on this issue, because it makes this argument quite powerfully. I'm just going to quote from a couple of sentences from it. It talks about the impact of trafficking in terms of impeding economic growth for law-abiding businesses and curtailing legitimate employment opportunities for millions of people. And obviously poverty, armed conflict, poor access to education and legal employment all heighten the risk that traffickers will target the vulnerable. And of course, it is the vulnerable. It is the more uneducated. It is the people in poverty who are so desperate to help their families. It is people who are affected by drugs. It is people who have been forced from their homes and are fleeing for their lives and have lost all their resources over and over again. It is the most vulnerable who are victimized here, although it can cut across, particularly with social media, almost every level of people who on social media are approached or being offered love, being offered employment opportunities that they otherwise wouldn't have. There are all kinds of ways that social media distorts normal interactions in this regard. And religious leaders and faith organizations are absolutely vital. Marcio laid out that argument very strongly. Let me just mention some of the different ways that this plays out. There are, at a minimum, 10 million houses of worship or institutions directly run by religious groups across the globe. In those institutions and houses of worship, we have many people who are include those who can be victimized. And we have to worry about what happens in those institutions. But faith leaders often have an opportunity to recognize people who come to them manifesting problems that are often identified with symptoms of trafficked people that otherwise they wouldn't have access to here, or families who come to them about parents concerned about behavior of kids or young adult children that they have. So institutions are religious institutions, vitally important, not only in terms of all the positive services that they can provide that Marcio discussed, but simply because it represents a wide swath of the population on Earth who can be affected by trafficking. And it's not surprising that DHS's Blue Campaign developed specific resources for faith-based community leaders. In terms of the kind of provision of services that Marcio talked about. There is, of course, the Alliance to End Human Trafficking, Catholic Sisters, originally in the United States, but now on an international level, that are providing a wide range of education, of survivor services, engaging in advocacy to eradicate human trafficking here. But they're all part of the broader network now of Consecrated Life Against Trafficking in Persons, Talitha Kum, that is felt in many countries across the globe, providing those kinds of services. The group Kevin is so engaged with, the Santa Marta group, that combines law enforcement and the religious community, that can be a really powerful presence in combating trafficking here. And I'll let Kevin talk about that, since he plays such an important role. In the Jewish community, the Free the Slaves Passover project, developed by one of my former legislative assistants at the Religious Action Center, a very prominent and conservative movement rabbi, in a campaign to enlist Jewish schools and congregations and communities into a network mobilized against human trafficking. The Sakina network in Canada, a Muslim network, really targeting the Muslim community, able to reach its own people in ways that interfaith groups often are not as adept at doing. The Salvation Army, with the projects that it's doing across the globe. In Australia, the Lived Experience Engagement Network, that is an advisory group to the Australian government that they developed. In Uganda, the work they're doing in Ukraine, having private homes that are bringing victims of trafficking or those who might be most vulnerable, and giving them a nurturing environment of safety for a while. So there are many programs and projects like that going on around the world. And of course, the ability of the pulpit to help educate people in the congregation of what trafficking is, along the lines of what Tatiana had pointed out, to educate people about what the legal options are for people who are trafficked, as Yasmin has done so effectively, and to help people recognize the signs of people who may be trafficked and open up their congregations in providing services to victims who are identified by law enforcement or others in their own community. All of this is a value added that the religious community can offer, does offer, but could be multiplied many, many times over.
Thank you so much, David. You've given us a very powerful argument, both for the importance of the G20 role as the G20 leaders prepare to meet in November, but also to the extraordinarily diverse, and I think much too little documented work of a wide range of religious communities. So there are powerful moral, but also very practical issues, some of which come back to education and some of which come back to practical day-to-day steps that affect people's lives of this extraordinarily vulnerable set of communities all over the world. We come last, but by no means least, to Kevin Highland. Kevin plays a very special role in this field. For anyone who doesn't know Kevin's life story, I commend you an interview that he and I did that describes his 30-year work as a police officer, his extraordinary successes in addressing issues of trafficking, in part working with religious communities, and his, quote, retirement work as he has taken up the global cause of human trafficking in many, many different settings. He's been part of the G20 Interfaith for several years and has contributed to what we hope is a growing awareness within the G20 community of the importance of this issue and the potential to do more. But I think Kevin always sees more opportunities and more need. So with that, Kevin, over to you.
Thank you very much, Catherine, and thank you to the G20 Interfaith Forum for all the work they're doing, and to you and your organisation for keeping this agenda alive. And I think the value of today really is we've heard different accounts from different people of different backgrounds explaining what can be done to address the issue of human trafficking. And I've had the good fortune to work with all the people on the panel and see the incredible work that is done in order to address those issues, and often in some of the most difficult situations. I know Tatiana's worked across Africa in very, very challenging situations, and the Scalabrini fathers working many challenging areas, and Yasmin has taken on cases that are really some of the most difficult that nobody wants. And for years, when I was a police officer, Yasmin and I worked tirelessly to bring together cases so that hundreds of people could be supported through the courts, not just in criminal justice outcomes, but importantly for the victim with reparation and compensation. And of course, David is well known for his continual work, particularly across Interfaith Forum. And I think that's what this organisation brings, the interfaith work of faith working together. Too often we see the reports that faith doesn't work together. When we see on this issue, it does. And when it comes together, the outcomes are fantastic. But what we need to do is, going back to what Tatiana said, the scale of this, 50 million people across the world, creating at least 236 billion in revenue for criminal acts. And they happen in the many ways that Tatiana explained. But the one thing that is always clear with trafficking, it's never inevitable. It can only happen when a country, an individual, a group, or an organized crime group decide they're going to traffic people. They're going to deliberately use people as a commodity. And of course, we've had legislation going back 95 years with the Forced Labour Convention at international level. We've had 25 years almost since the Palermo Protocol, and 10 years since the Sustainable Development Goals, and 74 different regulations in the ILO to try and make work better. And we've had a ruling only in the last few weeks at the European courts that investigations of human trafficking, because it is a human rights issue, are mandatory. Support of victims are mandatory. That's unlike most crimes. Yet, is it happening in a mandatory way? No. So we need to start understanding about the crime, how it has impact, as we've heard today, on security, terrorism, on the economy. But ultimately, as Father Marcio said, everyone is God's child, the individual person. And that's the great thing about the Interfaith Forum. It can work at the highest level of strategy, but always remembers the person. So what I want to see happen is the establishment of a working group through the Interfaith Forum with the G20, where we can bring together this unique opportunity of people who are working across the globe in the front line, bring together leaders, former prime ministers, former EU members of the European Parliament, senators, Congress reps from across the globe, the African Union, who is very interested in engaging with this subject as we move forward to the G20 next year, bringing them together to develop policy. But we need to make sure that that policy is not just another document that sits somewhere. It needs to be a document that is looking at the challenges, is actually making governments accountable, making businesses accountable, looking at new laws, like, for example, in the EU, where businesses will be accountable and can face a sanction if they have trafficking in their supply chain. Also looking at the internet. For example, millions of people in the US, and I mean millions, are subject of frauds that have happened because of trafficking that's happening in Cambodia, where people are being held against their will in these centers where they're doing frauds to generally vulnerable people in the United States. The second country where that's happening is the United Kingdom. And in the United Kingdom, about 2.8 million people have been subject of those frauds. Yet do we see the countries in the G20 actually saying, well, the problem is happening the other side of the world, and we need to assist that region in prevention. So we need to start looking at online and the crimes that happen online in a very mature, very sophisticated way. We also then need to start looking at the idea of the money that is created by trafficking, but not just proceeds of crime. What about the profit that's generated? What about all this 236 billion? Where is it? Let's start looking for it proactively. And when we find it, let's use it for reparation. Let's use it to actually give economies, communities and their economies boosted. And let's also use it for actually good work. So there are lots of opportunities. And then we have the structures that are already there. Let's start really using them. Let's start understanding them. Let's start implementing. And let's create leadership with a moral compass. And I think to do this, we need to create a vision that by 2030, when we hit the end of the Sustainable Development Goals, we have got this whole agenda into a position where it is actually starting to win the fight. And I believe that's going to take at least $30 billion invested across G20 countries. And that doesn't mean to say countries have got to come up with cash. It means that they've got to have policies or processes that generate processes. For example, the EU laws will mean that companies will have to employ staff and invest in prevention, invest in making sure that they don't have these issues within their networks. Prevention is the best way. The reason why planes very rarely fall out of the sky, and it is a very rare occurrence, is because of the safety around the plane, because of the prevention. If we look at the way we've developed prevention around road safety, it means that road deaths in most of our countries have fallen to a very low number over the years, an extremely low number compared to where they were when there were fewer vehicles on the road. So we need to have policies that are about prevention, but we also need to have, as Yasmin said, as Tatiana said, and as Marcio said, and as David said, accountability and also support for victims. So my proposal is that the G20, through the Interfaith Forum, creates a working group that can bring the richness globally together to actually start to encourage countries within the G20 and its partners to actually properly invest in this crime, properly resource it, and place it at the top of the political agenda. And I think we're on the cusp of doing that. And that's something we should really grab hold of this year in Brazil, push it for next year when we come to the G20 in South Africa, and then have it in place for when we arrive in the US in 2026. So it's something that is actually being delivered. And by the time we get to 2030, at least on the SDGs associated to human trafficking, and on this issue that has so many other impacts, we can start to say that we are making a difference. And we're starting that process of leaving no one behind. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Kevin. And thank you all. We have a few minutes left because you've been so efficient. So I will suggest that each of you, if you have 1 minute of anything you might have wanted to add or that you want to emphasize, that I will give each of you the minute. But I wanted to start with just a bit of a 101 on the G20 for those who are not familiar. The G20, founded in 1999, started focusing on the crises that affect the world, what we now call the poly crisis or the mega crisis or the perma crisis. But its mandate has expanded because it is more inclusive than the G7. It includes many more countries, but it is also nimble and flexible because it is designed as a meeting of leaders as opposed to a permanent, structured, bureaucratic global institution. But it meets in a different country each year. So last year, the host country was India. For 2024, the host country is Brazil, which has taken a very strong leadership role. And on December 1st, South Africa will take over the mantle. And as Kevin was suggesting, the year after, the United States will be the host for the G20 and therefore having a role in setting the agenda. So the G20 Interfaith Forum has operated for 10 years, and it aims to bring the best of religious commitment, work, ideas, and experience into the G20 process with the idea that religious institutions are too often invisible or seen negatively. So with that, Tatiana, do you have a minute or two?
I definitely do. Thank you so much, Catherine. I want to turn actually to the point of survivors. So I've been fortunate enough while I was working as the advisor on anti-trafficking issues for the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe to set up the first International Survivors of Trafficking Advisory Council. So one which is very much alike as been set up in the US, but internationally. In many of the conversations and work that I've done on trafficking issues in various capacities over multiple decades now, actually, what I've learned from survivors is that the first thing that happens is that they lose their faith in God. That's the kind of damage that human trafficking does to human dignity, to your soul. And I've also worked actually on creating the frameworks internationally, or what is called the National Referral Mechanism guidelines for OSC that are used globally. And part of that process is also bringing the person to social inclusion and recovery, because yes, we have a victim, but eventually we want to have a survivor and somebody that is thriving. For many victims who've become survivors and survivor leaders, faith has been that process as well. And that brings back your humanity, faith in other people, but also just the healing power of self-forgiveness and self-love as well, or love, which many of the religions actually create a pathway to for many of the victims and survivors. So this is my point number one, when it comes to faith and human trafficking, and I'll get to point number two very quickly, which is that there are real solutions in place. As Kevin has said, it's not about putting band-aids on the issue, but putting real solutions where accountability is first and foremost, and this is seen as a crime that all of us work together on. Various stakeholders, but this is seen as a crime, and this crime needs resources such as our fight on terrorism, which this is connected to, our fight on crime as well. So thank you.
I think this point of nothing about us without us is a very critical one that we have to engage and hear from the victims in a very meaningful way. Yasmin.
Thank you. It's been a really fascinating discussion, and I'm very happy to contribute to it. I was struck by what David said and other commentators about the number of institutions that are connected to faith, both within the Christian or the Jewish or the Muslim communities. And it seems to me that we need to think about materials and education within communities and faith groups and the Muslim community as well, so that we can get it out through mosques and through churches and synagogues. And to some extent that happens, but it would be helpful to have a greater emphasis on that educational piece. The prevention piece is so important, and we end up tackling the aftermath and the tragedy that happens afterwards, but it is that education piece, and to touch so many people at the heart of what they believe in and addresses their values.
Thank you. I think that's very much what we're trying desperately or urgently to do, is to educate and to communicate the message not of desperation alone, but of real hope and real tools. Marcia.
I'd like to remember a phrase that Pope Francis insisted some years ago: the journey in dignity, listen, dream, and act. 3 verbs. Then, according to experience in the intersection of Santa Baquita, it's so important to listen, dream, and act to protect, to prevent the victims. It's important to listen them, to know better the strategies that they felt, to dream, it's possible to work together, to plan together, and to act. I think in this way we can fight, we can win this fight. Listen, dream, and act. Thank you.
That's wonderful. Listen, dream, and act. David, any final suggestions? Mute.
Just two observations. At first I saw the fascinating question about impoverished, uneducated widows in Africa that someone posted, which just testifies to why the G20 is necessary. There are so many structural challenges involved in addressing that problem. It's impossible for anything other than government level organized efforts, cooperative efforts at a global level that the G20 represents. Here, and I will just point out that amongst the approximately 50 million victims of trafficking here, nearly half of them are people who are in forced marriages. Here, and they're often overlooked in the kind of discussions that we've had here. And that really is a place the faith community can have an impact here, and is not really addressed it at the level they can. So I simply wanted to put a marker down on all of those millions of people who are trapped in their own ways as profoundly as we think of others in more commercial sex exploitation and commercial forced labor kinds of setting. And that involves forced sex, forced labor as well. And we often overlook that category as one that the faith community really has a responsibility for and can be effective in addressing.
Thank you for bringing both those points in. That is a particularly important one, and one that with the boy preference that has led to distortions in demography in parts of the world is fueling a whole new set of patterns of forced marriage in different parts of the world.
Listen,
Kevin,
education for young girls is the
Yeah.
single best thing we can do across the front of so many of these structural problems that we have. So I'm glad you pointed that out.
Kevin, quick last word.
Sure, just to talk about the training part and the awareness, the Santa Marta Group developed training for dioceses that could be spread across parishes and for parishioners. And Father Marcio and I have been working together for some time now and developing work for not just their religious order, but for their communities that they serve and they work in. So, you know, these are the ways of getting the message out there. But at the G20 level, you know, we need to work. For example, as you said, there's over 100 countries in the G20 through the EU and the African Union. But one of the things, for example, is there's over 870 billion US dollars in remittances every year. And about 660 billion of that is to low and middle income countries. And those people are paying more on remittances or for their remittances than any of us would. And a lot of them get stolen. And, you know, when you think about this is perhaps hundreds of billions that are being stolen. If we could actually make sure that that money stays in the hands of the workers, then they can develop their own families. They don't need handouts. They want to get paid for work and they want the work to go home. Remittances. I live in Ireland. Ireland was built on remittances. Countries can be built on remittances. People go for work to feed their families or their siblings or their parents or their grandparents. And we should be working as one thing that the G20 can do, just one of the many things it needs to do on fighting trafficking, making sure that people who work, particularly migrant workers, enjoy the pleasures and the rights that they should have with that work. And that falls into so many things that David said about the roles of the G20. And I think that's one that we as the IF can really achieve.
Thank you. You froze for a bit. Want to thank all of you for your very moving and very informative and very creative ideas of the power of prevention, the desperation of people, the need to listen to people, the need for accountability, the need for clearer mechanisms, and above all, perhaps the need for empathy and education. In a specific sense, a number of questions have been raised in the chat, and we may hear others. We will address those offline. The recording of this webinar will be available soon on the websites of the Berkley Center at Georgetown University and the G20 Interfaith Forum. And we will be continuing as we look to the G20 Summit in November, which is preceded by a social summit of civil society organizations, including the G20 Interfaith, where these issues will be highlighted, because we have a powerful impulse, a powerful commitment to the idea that religious communities, above all, highlight the needs of the most vulnerable in the world and are committed to bringing their concerns and their possibilities into the discussions on the global agenda, and specifically the G20. So thank you all very much and have a good day.